when students get into the part where they're actually using the data and what could we test for, how could we solve this, it really does bring in this idea of like, how do we do science? What would we do to find out what happened? Today we are going to focus on another type of scientific teaching called case study pedagogy. So you all read your case study. I just asked you guys to briefly read over it, but really we're going to do some work today so that we all get sort of familiar with case study pedagogy. The learning objectives I have for today, I have 3 clear learning objectives, and I sort of have scaffolded 3 activities that we'll do around these learning objectives. The first thing we're going to do is you're going to be able to describe the type of content and concepts that can be delivered through case study pedagogy. And for this, we're going to do an activity where we think about what kind of science content is conveyed and what kind of contextual content is conveyed in the case study. The second outcome is that you'll be able to explain how case study pedagogy can create an inclusive learning environment. And for this, we're going to draw on, I've brought you 2 frameworks for inclusion in education, and you're going to work with those frameworks to align them with case study pedagogy. And then you'll be able to identify ways to assess student learning during case studies. And we'll have a discussion over this between different ideas for formative assessments and summative assessments. First group activity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, I know we have different types of prior knowledge in the group, so I'm going to switch you folks into groups where there's somebody with biology content and somebody with education content, and you're going to pair up, and what you're going to do is you're going to go through the case study and start to look for what kind of content is being conveyed in the case study. And I want you to keep an eye on, the topic, which is biology and microbiology content and concepts. But I also want you to keep an eye out for other stuff. There's other information and knowledge that's shared in this case study, and see if you can identify some of that. So you guys can work in groups. Why don't, Russell, do you want to switch to that side for biology? And Alicia, come over here and you can work as an education specialist. Just start how about for biology and micro content, what kind of stuff is being introduced and covered in the case study?
I thought it was pretty interesting since there's this meticulousness part of it. Like sometimes I think in science, sometimes we're not super meticulous, but sometimes it is this meticulous process where we're trying to control. So something about trying to control the variables all these variables that are in play. I don't know what it is, but it's
so how about something like ways of doing science are really sort of broadly and specifically sort of showcased, right? Because we hear about cheese making, right? And it's like a detailed little excerpt about how to make cheese. When students get into the part where they're actually using the data and trying to propose what could we test for, how could we solve this, it really does bring in this idea of how do we do science, right? So it's asking students to sort of put on that scientific hat and what would we do to find out what happened? And it gives them some context for that. So I would ways of doing science are sort of showcased. come back together as a group, and here I've heard some really great conversations over both of the frameworks. So why don't we bring it back and let's hear some examples of what you folks came up with. So the first three bullets I have up here are three of the tenets from critical inclusive pedagogy. So positive faculty-student interaction, create sharing power, activate student voice. Anyone want to volunteer a moment from the missing microbe that you kind of mapped to any of these or all of these?
So for faculty-student interaction, since there are stop points throughout the case study, there's an opportunity for students to talk about it, think about what's wrong, what are the problems and how can we fix it. So definitely spark students to think and out loud and share each other's thoughts.
Great. So what could, if as opposed to a traditional, science classroom setting, if the students are charged with working on those problems together, it definitely opens up the avenue for the instructor to sort of collaborate, to walk around the room, to be available for questions or to ask questions, for students to ask questions. So there's these places in that pedagogy, in that case study, that opens the door for these positive faculty-student interactions, which can look very different than if I was just the lecturer and I was going to tell you the answer to the story. I was going to be the one doing all the talking, right? It really shifts that. So let's push that a little further. There's Spanish dialogue in this case study. What do you think about this idea of activating student voices? How does having, typically you walk into a classroom, it's going to always be in English. How do you think that might flip the script for some students?
I guess if you have a classroom that's mixed Spanish and English speakers, since the class is mostly English, that kind of feels like a de facto power to the English speakers. It's
Right.
Language I've grown up speaking, so it's in this language, so that the voice is pretty well heard. But by putting chunks of it in Spanish, it kind of forces just English speakers to kind of take a back seat, because you can have that explained to you, what is actually going on here, and would give a Spanish speaker a really easy way to be well, now I'm going to contract this.
Exactly. Right, so this idea that we could bring a different language into the classroom, we're bringing a different culture in, right, via the cheese story. We're even bringing different dialogue in, right? So we're able to really activate student voices by potentially just moving over a dominant language and making space for another language, which also happens to be a dominant language in this country. And to speak, to your idea of that power shift, right? This really gets back to those moments of expert, novice, right? The knowledge, the prior knowledge that one might hold in the case study context might be outside of the science domain, and it might very well be in another domain. And it gives an opportunity for students to kind of have moments of, hey, I'm the expert. I heard, Russell, I heard you were able to translate for Stephanie what they were saying. Alicia, you can read Spanish. Corrales, you speak Spanish. So you guys were able to help decode that piece, right, where it wasn't in English. And then that shifts the dynamic. It definitely creates sharing power in groups, right? And activates student voices that might not otherwise have been activated.
First of all, we had two women as the protagonists to this,
Correct.
but that the scientist was very kind to Sophie. There was a lot of kindness in the story. And when we were talking, that you have to be a real jerk to put aggression into this. You have to really actively.
Right, it would be explicit or something. You would be oh, that's not very.
So it's funny that you say that, right? But I can assure you that I have read case studies where the dialogue between scientists that's portrayed seems to be intentionally written to be not kind, to be threatening, to sort of showcase STEM as a place where there is no caring, where there's not room for creativity, and where there's not room for humanity. So fascinating enough, right? We probably do run into moments in the development of teaching materials where without a careful attention to a framework for inclusion, you might do
Right.
things that would signal to students, hey, STEM is this one way, it might not be for you. If you don't like the way these people are talking to each other or the way this scene is playing out, that's what STEM is, maybe it's not for you, right? Alicia, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, like I was thinking like one of the things that maybe we wouldn't have caught on is like at the, it's like a subtle shift that could have happened in this case study. It might have been like, where did Sophia go wrong? It was like, no, what happened to the cheese?
Cheese, right,
And like I could see where a case study might have been written where I was like, where did she go wrong?
right.
And like I don't know if people would have caught on to that, but like it's like something subtle, like no, what happened to the cheese? Not what did Sophia do wrong?
Wrong, exactly. You're right, that's a very small detail.
Yeah.
The way this narrative is constructed, it's a counter narrative to something like that.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. We've talked about inclusion, and we know that the case studies convey content, but where and when can we assess learning during case studies? So what you're going to work on in your groups is you're going to focus on one specific piece of the missing microbe. It's the part where students are getting this data, and here's a moment where they have gram stain. They are going to be able to, if they have the right knowledge, they get the knowledge of gram stain down, if they're understanding cell morphology, they're going to be able to come to the right conclusion, right? This is a moment in the case study where finally there's really kind of a right and a wrong scientific endeavor. So thinking about this moment, there's a multitude of things that one could do in the classroom, whether it's informal or formal, to really assess what's going on with learning at this point. So work in your groups to come up with maybe one example from each quadrant. One formative, informal, one formative, formal, one summative, informal, one summative, formal. And then we'll kind of put all our ideas together and see what creative ideas we come up with for assessment. What I'm gonna have you do is kind of push the content of today a little bit further with your discussion board assignment. So today's discussion board assignment is going to be that you, after that really rich discussion about the content that's in the case studies, I want you to design learning outcomes. If you were going to teach this case study in your classroom, what would be your learning outcomes for your students? And ones that you would express to them so they could really stay on track with their learning. So I want you to go in on the discussion board, post 3 to 4 learning outcomes that you designed by yourself. Then I want the discussion thread to kind of follow up on you folks talking to each other about whether or not, remember we have these ideas of lower order and higher order learning. See if you can map some of that, those ideas to the learning outcomes that everybody's designing. And please make sure your comments are respectful, helpful, and critical without being critical. Or on your meta reflection for this week, I want you to recall how we talked about there were moments today when you were experts and novices in the different group work you did, right? So I want you to reflect on your moments today when you were an expert and when you were a novice. When did you have prior knowledge of any kind, and how did that impact the learning or the group work? And then I want you to connect that to what we learned about case study pedagogy today, and really connect your experience as experts, novices, prior knowledge, no prior knowledge, to that case study environment and how case studies create expert novice moments, how can case studies activate different types of prior knowledge, and how can this help foster inclusion in the classroom. So this is your one-page discussion that you'll upload by Sunday this week.